The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to the 12, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Grace and peace to you from God, our Creator, from Jesus, our Redeemer, and from the Holy Spirit, who saves us all, who redeems us all, whatever the thing is. Sustains, that's the word. Sorry. So this gospel is a continuation from the sending of the 12, when the disciples are invited to go out into the community, to multiply the ministry of Jesus, to preach, to teach, and to heal those. They're kind of following in the model that Jesus has for them. And it's a little bit of a dangerous path because these are mostly Jewish men going into the Roman world and going to share the gospel with people who are Gentiles, who did not necessarily know who Jesus was, maybe didn't even know who God was. And so the disciples are being invited to go out into that risky and vulnerable space. And so as they're doing that, Jesus is kind of encouraging them at the end of this little sending of the 12 sayings that happen in the Gospel of Matthew, that there's going to be blessings that come upon those who are welcoming them into their space because they're in this position of vulnerability. And so when we're welcoming others, Jesus is reminding that we are welcoming the face of God, that when people are welcoming in the disciples, that it's not just them that they're welcoming, but it's the message of God that they're welcoming, and it's the invitation of God that is coming into their lives. And so I think that is a great place for us to kind of begin and to remember what it means when we welcome people into our spaces and places. Because each time we're invited in, it is a key moment for our belonging. We can either be invited in or we can be invited out. I don't know if you've ever walked up to a group of people standing in a circle and you're kind of new to this space and you walk on up to the circle and they don't even say anything to you. They just continue on their conversation. And those moments are very isolating and can be. And so I think, but there's other moments when you walk into that group and the person next to you turns and says, "Hey, what's your name? My name's Rachel. I would love to bring you into this space and to invite you into it." And that can set us up to be received as being belonged, or it can set us up to be completely set aside and ostracized. And so I think how we remember to invite and to welcome in others just is key for how we perceive spaces. It's key for how people perceive this space, and it's key for how people perceive us out in the world. And as the disciples are going in, they're trying to share, but they also are in this position of vulnerability. They're also in this space of not knowing and of uncertainty. But this language of rewards that Jesus is mentioning sounds a little icky. Haley, our youth minister, said that it sounds a little bit like karma, which is how I first read this when I was reading it this week. And I tend to think, from my Southern Baptist upbringing, that it's this reward from heaven, that it's our salvation that's tied up in that. Sorry. But it's not. Heaven's nowhere near mentioned in this gospel. If you do dig deeper into what that word means, it could mean a reward of money or a payment of wages. But I also think it could mean the things that we get from when we welcome others. Because when we welcome people, we get to change too. We get to make a new friend. We get to learn about their story and be transformed by it. Because the ways in which we interact people change us. They bring a different composition into our worlds. And so I don't think thinking about it as a heavenly reward is at all what this gospel is talking about. I think it's talking about the ways that we change in our midst. It goes on to share about how the prophets and the righteous and how those who give a cold drink of water are going to be perceived, how they're going to be welcomed and rewarded. Prophets are called to do and proclaim justice, even when it's hard. especially when it's hard. Those who are speaking truth to power. And it doesn't just say, prophets don't just proclaim it, but they have to live it with their lives, by the way that their postures embrace those around them, by the way that they see those sitting next to them, and by the way that they live in their lives, seeking to do good in their communities. MLK says that today we particularly need the Hebrew prophets because they taught that to love God was to love justice, and that each human being has an inexplicable obligation to denounce evil. I am obsessed with the Hebrew prophets. I think that they are a great resource to process the world that they live in and that we live in. The times that they lived in were deeply tumultuous and challenging. One of my favorites is Jeremiah, which just happens to be the first reading for today. Jeremiah was prophesying in a time of deep transition for the people of exile, the people of Israel, because they were going into a state of exile. The text says that they had forsaken God, chosen other gods, that they had lost their way. They didn't remember what it was to welcome people. They didn't remember what it was to invite people in. And so Jeremiah is speaking truth to them, telling them to turn back to God, to do love in their world and in their society. But they continue to not. They continue to reject that message time and time again. But Jeremiah remembers that he loves each and every one of these people. His words are almost always kind, telling God and telling them that they are loved, that they should turn back to this. One of my favorite scholars says that Jeremiah is reminding the people of the ethos of God by how he's representing it to the world. But for our reading today, it was talking about Hananiah, who is a false prophet. He's telling them that their time in exile is going to end much sooner, that the king of Babylon is going to die. He's giving them a false narrative, and where Jeremiah is trying to tell them, no, this is going to last for a lot longer. We don't know when this is going to end, but God is going to be faithful with us even in this season. It's really hard to know which voices to believe in our world, and to know which ones are prophesying the true peace. And so our reading kind of comes from Jeremiah and Hananiah talking about this. And Jeremiah says that the prophets who preceded you and me from ancient times prophesied war and famine and pestilence against many countries and great kingdoms. As for the prophet who prophesies peace, when the word of that prophet comes true, then it will be known that the Lord has truly sent the prophet. So Jeremiah is saying that there have been many prophets that have come before him, all of which who have prophesied a great evil coming upon them, often destruction, often loneliness and isolation from God. That doesn't mean that God has left them, but it does mean that they're coming upon a great trial and hardship. But he says that those who prophesy peace will know that the Lord has sent that prophet. So as this is kind of talking about peace in a more sense of wholeness. In the Hebrew, it means shalom, and shalom is a sense of deep and abiding peace, of wholeness in their midst. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a little easy for a minute and then it's going to get hard. It means that that in the midst we're going to be able to confront, we're going to be able to make peace in that space. And so it's not just about keeping the peace. It's about making the peace and figuring out how to do that and figuring out how to speak truth to power continuously, even in that midst. And so Jeremiah is reminding Hananiah that the one that's coming, the one that will be, will say that and will do that, indicating maybe Jesus, maybe it's just somebody who's going to be speaking in the midst of a time of destruction. But I think in context of our gospel, I think we can really see that prophecy coming as the disciples are going out and going to be experiencing this sense of vulnerability as they're engaging in their communities. And in that place, they're able to speak the truth and speak the truth that's becoming that is making peace amid them. I got to take a class on Gandhi this last semester in a women's prison, which was an immense joy of mine. I didn't really know that I would be that excited to learn about Gandhi. He's quite a controversial person, but I saw and learned a lot in him that reminded me a lot of Jeremiah. It reminded me a lot of Jesus, because Gandhi says over and over again that as you're fighting this fight against people who don't want all of our prosperity, you have to see the human in them, to remember to love them in every single space. And I think that is such a beautiful thing to say and to see in people. He had this practice called satyagraha, which was the means of which nonviolent resistance happened. People when he was living were very opposed to it. They wanted violence because they wanted change to happen faster, which is an easy thing to desire. But Gandhi pushed for this long, slow, but persistent struggle. And he said that if we did that, I want my enemies to change. I want their hearts to be convicted. I don't want them to just be coerced into what I'm wanting. I want them to have a transformation inside of their spirits. Prophets' rewards are quite hard. Often they're in the space of loneliness. Jeremiah sat in a cistern in a well and cried out to God for who knows how long. Gandhi ended up dying because he was murdered. But I think a prophet does get a reward in learning to live into their values, because they're able to continue to speak truth to power and to continually proclaim justice and to live that out in their lives. And that, I think, is something that we are called to as well, to learn to live into our values, even when it's hard, even when society doesn't want us to. The next thing is the path of righteousness, that those who will receive the righteous reward. But I really don't like righteousness. I think that comes from my need to be self-righteous as a kid. I always wanted to do the right thing, and I was looking to make sure that people saw that I was doing the right thing. But the more that I've spent time studying righteousness, the more I realize that it's not about who sees you. In fact, if people are seeing you and rewarding you for it, it's not living in true righteousness. Because righteousness is just pursuing God's way of doing things, which often is being humble. It's often turning the other cheek. It's often remembering to give to others even when it's hard. Righteousness is pursuing God's way of doing things. And that is, you get rewarded for that because you get to live in the way that God lives, not because you get this grand heavenly entrance or anything like that, but because you are living in the commitments and the covenants of God. The next part is a little weird. He says, whoever gives a cup of cold water to these little ones. I first thought maybe this is talking about children, or maybe this is talking about, I don't even know, but I'm digging deeper. I think that he's talking about the disciples. He's seeing their vulnerability. Jesus is seeing their vulnerability and saying that whoever meets you with a cup of water is going to begin to see your vulnerability. It's going to see your need. Seeing people's vulnerabilities is often an opportunity to create equity in our world. There's so much injustice that happens. There's people who make more than enough money and people who make not enough money. And sometimes being able to see someone's need that comes into your midst and being able to meet that is one small action that we get to create equity in our midst. I went on a trip to Israel when I was in high school, and when I was there, it was really just a trip, but one day we went and volunteered in the community, and we were painting and cleaning up this space, working in the hot sun for quite some time. And eventually these people came out to us after working a few hours, and they brought us water. They brought us drinks, and they brought us food to nourish us, to restore us, and to revitalize us. These were generous actions and generous gifts. We were the ones who were visiting their place And they were seeing us and saying, we're welcoming you in, we're inviting you in, and we're going to meet your need. Those times that we invite people in, they change us and they shift us because we're able to see the humanity, see God in them. When we welcome others, we get to experience new relationships, expand our communities time and time again. In this gospel, it's in the sending of the 12, Jesus is inviting them to preach, to teach, and to heal. When they preach, they're prophesying, they're speaking truth to power time and time again. And as they're teaching righteousness, what that looks like in the world, how to live a life of faithfulness to God. And then they're healing, seeing people's needs. And it's not a blessing it's not a reward that comes from just earning that, but it's a blessing that God is giving and bestowing to people because they are seeing other people's needs. Amen.